The Japanese radio operators heard him before they saw him. A single American fighter screaming in from the open Pacific at barely 50 feet above the Whitecaps. No formation, no warning, just the rising howl of a Pratt and Whitney engine pushing through the morning haze toward their shoreline. The coastal watchers on Mili Atoll had perhaps 15 seconds to process what was happening before the Hellcat was already over the beach, its guns raking positions that had never been hit from that direction, at that altitude, in that way. The pilot pulled up hard, vanished into a low cloud bank, and was gone before anti-aircraft crews could traverse their weapons. For a moment, the radio net went silent. Then came the frantic chatter, disbelief crackling through every frequency. How had he known where to come? How had he come in so low, so fast, so alone? And the question no one could answer in that moment of confusion, a question that would define a new kind of Pacific air warfare. Would he come back? The Central Pacific in early 1944 was a corridor of violence stretching across 2,000 miles of open ocean. Island chains that had once been colonial afterthoughts, copra plantations and phosphate mines and missionary outposts, had become the vertebrae of empire. Japan had fortified them into a defensive spine meant to bleed any American advance until Tokyo could negotiate from strength. And for the aviators of the United States Navy, these islands represented something more immediate than strategy. They were targets, they were threats, they were places where friends disappeared. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns had proven that carrier aviation could crack open fortified atolls, but at tremendous cost. Japanese defenders had learned to dig deep, to disperse, to camouflage, and to wait. High-altitude bombing looked impressive on gun camera film, but often churned sand and coral without touching the real defenses. The anti-aircraft networks on these islands had grown denser and more lethal through hard experience. By early 1944, American strike planners faced a grim arithmetic. Every major island attack meant losing aircraft, losing pilots, losing the institutional knowledge that kept squadrons effective. The fleet had grown massive since the dark days of 1942, when a handful of carriers had held the entire Pacific. Now the fast carrier task forces could put hundreds of aircraft over a target, but mass did not equal precision, and precision was what the island-hopping campaign demanded. Mili Atoll sat in the eastern Marshalls, bypassed by the main invasion force that had seized Kwajalein and Eniwetok. But bypassed did not mean ignored. The Japanese garrison there still operated radio stations, still watched American movements, still maintained aircraft that could theoretically threaten supply lines. The Navy's answer was neutralization through repeated strikes, keeping these bypassed garrisons pinned down and ineffective without committing the ground forces needed to actually seize them. The men who flew these neutralization missions understood their peculiar role in the war. They were not part of the grand, decisive battles. They were exterminators, returning again and again to the same islands, grinding down defenses that had no hope of reinforcement but refused to surrender. It was dangerous work that produced no headlines, no promotions, no glory, just the steady accumulation of risk with each sortie. The morning of March 15th, 1944, began like dozens of others for the pilots of Air Group 16 aboard the carrier Lexington. The briefing room smelled of coffee, sweat, and the peculiar metallic tang of a ship at war. Charts showed the familiar kidney shape of Mili Atoll, the locations of known anti-aircraft positions marked in red grease pencil, the approach vectors that doctrine prescribed. Standard stuff. Routine stuff. The kind of mission that killed men precisely, because they had flown it so many times that the danger became abstract. But one pilot in that briefing room was already thinking differently. He had been watching the patterns, studying the failures, and he had begun to suspect that everything they knew about attacking these islands was wrong. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buie had not planned on becoming a naval aviator. Growing up in rural South Carolina during the Depression, his ambitions had been modest and practical. He wanted stability. He wanted to escape the grinding poverty that had defined his childhood. The Navy offered both, and in 1934 he had walked into a recruiting office in Charleston without any particular vision of glory or adventure. He simply wanted a job that would not disappear when the crops failed. What he discovered in the Navy was an aptitude he had never suspected. Buie had the hands for flying. That was how the instructors described it. Some men could learn the mechanics of controlling an aircraft, could memorize the procedures and follow the checklists, but their movements remained deliberate, conscious, effortful. Buie flew the way other men walked. The stick became an extension of his arm. The throttle responded to intentions he barely needed to formulate. By the time he earned his wings at Pensacola in 1937, his instructors had marked him as someone to watch. The peacetime Navy offered slow advancement but intensive training. Buie cycled through squadrons, flew patrol bombers and observation float planes, accumulated the unglamorous hours that built genuine expertise. He learned to navigate by dead reckoning over open ocean, to read weather patterns from the color of distant clouds, to nurse a struggling engine home when the gauges showed nothing but bad news. These were not combat skills, they were survival skills, and they would matter more than anyone could have predicted. When war came, Buie was a lieutenant with 10 years of flying behind him, old by naval aviation standards, experienced in ways that the flood of new pilots could not match. He transitioned to fighters almost by accident, a reassignment driven by the desperate need for anyone who could handle high-performance aircraft. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which he first flew in late 1943, was unlike anything he had piloted before. Where his earlier aircraft had been workhorses designed for endurance and reliability, the Hellcat was a Predator built around a massive engine and 6 .50 caliber machine guns. It could dive faster than anything the Japanese flew. It could absorb damage that would have destroyed its predecessors. And in the hands of a pilot who understood its capabilities, it could do things that the tactical manuals had not yet imagined. Buie approached the Hellcat the way he approached everything in aviation. He studied it. He flew it to its limits, and then slightly beyond, always pushing to understand exactly where the boundaries were. He talked to the mechanics, learning what stressed the airframe, what wore out the fastest, what modifications improved performance. He read the accident reports, absorbing the lessons that other pilots had paid for with their lives. And gradually he formed opinions about how this aircraft should be, used that diverged sharply from the standard doctrine. The doctrine said fighters existed to escort bombers and to intercept enemy aircraft. The doctrine said strafing runs against ground targets should be conducted at moderate altitude, diving at perhaps 30 degrees, giving pilots time to identify targets and adjust their aim. The doctrine was written by men who had learned to fly before the war, when ammunition was expensive and practice targets did not shoot back. Buie thought the doctrine was going to get people killed. He had watched the strike missions against the Marshals from the ready room status boards, tracking the losses that accumulated mission after mission. He had talked to pilots who came back with holes in their aircraft and fragments in their flesh, men who described the wall of anti-aircraft fire that rose to meet every conventional attack, and he had begun to notice a pattern that no one else seemed to be discussing. The losses were not random. They clustered around specific moments in the standard attack profile, the moments of predictability, the moments when enemy gunners knew exactly where the attacking aircraft would be and how fast they would be moving. The doctrine that was supposed to protect pilots had become a template that enemy defenders could exploit. Buie started thinking about how to break the template. The fundamental problem of attacking a fortified island from the air was geometry. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to cover the approaches that enemy aircraft would logically use. These guns were sighted, practiced, and coordinated based on the assumption that attackers would follow certain patterns. Aircraft would come from the direction of their carriers. They would approach at altitudes that balanced accuracy against vulnerability. They would follow attack profiles that gave pilots time to aim. These assumptions were not arbitrary. They reflected real constraints. Carrier aircraft did need to return to their ships, which meant they could not stray too far from predictable vectors. Pilots did need to see their targets clearly enough to hit them. The standard doctrine emerged from rational calculations about how to maximize effectiveness while minimizing losses. But rational calculations could become deadly habits. By early 1944, Japanese anti-aircraft crews in the Marshals had been practicing against American attacks for months. They had learned the patterns. They knew when to open fire, at what altitude to set their fuses, where the diving aircraft would be at any given moment in their attack runs. What had begun as defensive improvisation had evolved into systematic slaughter. Buie studied the problem with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. He collected information from after-action reports, from conversations with pilots, from his own observations during missions. He drew diagrams showing the anti-aircraft coverage zones around typical island positions. He calculated approach angles, timing sequences, the mathematical relationships between speed, altitude, and vulnerability. And he reached a conclusion that seemed obvious once he framed it, but that contradicted everything in the standard doctrine. The safest place to fly near a heavily defended island was at extremely low altitude, coming in at high speed from an unexpected direction. This was counterintuitive because it seemed to put the aircraft directly in harm's way. But the mathematics told a different story. Anti-aircraft guns needed time to track, aim, and fire. At conventional attack altitudes and speeds, they had that time. A diving aircraft was moving relatively slowly, following a predictable arc that experienced gunners could lead. But an aircraft screaming in at wave-top height, approaching from an unexpected quarter at maximum speed, gave the gunners almost no time to react. The ocean itself provided cover. Radar systems of the era struggled to distinguish low-flying aircraft from sea clutter. Visual observers needed precious seconds to identify an approaching speck against the water. By the time coastal watchers could alert anti-aircraft positions, by the time crews could traverse their weapons, by the time anyone could calculate the lead required to hit something moving that fast, the attacking aircraft would already be past the beach and into its firing run. Buie believed this approach could work, but believing and proving were different things. The standard doctrine existed because it had been tested and validated through years of peacetime training and months of combat experience. What Buie was proposing had never been systematically attempted against a fortified position. The techniques involved were dangerous even in training. Flying at extreme low altitude over water, where a moment's inattention could put a wing into a wave. Approaching an enemy island from an unexpected direction, with all the navigational challenges that entailed. Pulling into a climbing strafing run at speeds that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. The doctrine said this was reckless. The mathematics said this might save lives. And Buie was increasingly certain that the mathematics were right. He began talking to other pilots, carefully, testing his ideas against their experience. Some dismissed him. The standard approach worked well enough, they argued. and the losses were just the cost of doing business. But others listened, men who had seen friends die in the familiar death spiral of a predictable attack run, men who had felt the gut twist of flying into a wall of tracers that the enemy seemed to know was coming. These pilots wanted to try something different. What Buie needed was an opportunity to prove his theory. What he got was Mili Atoll. The mission briefing on March 15th specified a conventional strike. Dive bombers would hit the runway and installations. Fighters would provide top cover and conduct strafing runs in support. Nothing unusual, nothing innovative. Just another neutralization mission against an island that had absorbed dozens of similar attacks without significant effect. Buie requested permission to try a different approach. He explained his reasoning to the air group commander, laying out the geometry, the timing calculations, the logic behind low-level attacks from unexpected vectors. The response was non-committal. Doctrine existed for reasons. Experimentation in combat could get people killed. Individual pilots could not simply ignore the plans that coordinated complex multi-squadron strikes, but neither was there an explicit prohibition. The air group commander left some ambiguity in his instructions. If tactical conditions warranted deviation from the standard profile, experienced pilots could exercise judgment. It was not an endorsement. It was also not a refusal. Buie launched with his division in the pre-dawn darkness, forming up on the running lights of the other Hellcats as the task force fell away behind them. The flight to Mili would take more than an hour, time enough to think, to second-guess, to rehearse mentally what he planned to attempt. The other pilots in his division knew something unusual was coming. Buie had discussed his ideas with them during the days leading up to the mission, had walked through the techniques he wanted to try, had made sure they understood both the potential benefits and the risks. They would follow his lead. Whether that lead would validate his theories or kill them all remained to be seen. The approach to Mili happened in the gray half-light of tropical dawn. The main strike force was already visible ahead, bombers climbing to altitude, fighters taking their escort positions, everything proceeding according to the doctrine that Buie had spent months questioning. The anti-aircraft defenses below would be tracking those aircraft now, predicting their movements, preparing the coordinated fire that had claimed so many American planes on so many previous missions. Buie took his division down. The descent was gradual at first, then increasingly steep as they dropped toward the wave tops. At 50 feet above the water, the ocean became a blur of gray and white, the swells rushing past with hypnotic speed. The aircraft trembled slightly in the disturbed air near the surface. There was no margin for error at this altitude. A moment of inattention, a gust of wind, a mechanical failure, and the Pacific would swallow them without trace. They swung wide of the main strike axis, curving around to approach Mili from a direction the defenders would not expect. Navigation at this altitude was challenging. No landmarks rose above the sea except the atoll itself, and approaching from an unfamiliar angle meant relying on dead reckoning, on the compass and the clock and the instincts built through years of flying. The first visual contact with the island came as a low gray line against the horizon. The radio was alive with chatter from the main strike, bombers calling their runs, fighters reporting contacts, the orchestrated chaos of a conventional attack. Buie and his pilots were silent, running without transmissions, hoping their approach had gone unnoticed. They had perhaps 2 miles of open water to cover between detection and the beach. At their speed, this translated to less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds during which they would be visible, trackable, theoretically vulnerable. 30 seconds that would determine whether Buie's calculations had been correct. The coastline rushed toward them with terrible speed. Buie could see the installations now, the revetments and bunkers, the anti-aircraft positions that should have been tracking him. But the guns that had been hammering at the main strike force remained pointed upward, toward the conventional threat, toward the aircraft following the doctrine. He crossed the beach at 100 feet, pulling into a climbing run, the 6 machine guns in his wings sending streams of tracers into a radio installation that had not expected death to come from the sea. The noise was overwhelming, the vibration of sustained fire shuddering through the airframe, the smell of cordite somehow finding its way into the cockpit. Behind him, his wingmen were hitting other targets, their guns adding to the chaos. And then they were through, climbing away over the lagoon, untouched, leaving behind them a confusion that would take the defenders precious minutes to understand. The radio chatter from the Japanese positions told the story more clearly than any after-action report could. Frantic calls overlapping, contradictory reports about aircraft appearing from impossible directions, requests for information that no one could provide. The defenders had been trained to repel conventional attacks. They had no framework for what had just happened. Buie circled and came in again. The second run was even more effective than the first. The initial confusion had spread through the defensive network. Gunners who should have been tracking the low-level threat were still oriented toward the high-altitude strike force. Others had received fragmentary reports about aircraft from the sea, but could not locate targets that moved too fast and flew too low for their sighting systems. Buie's division came in from a different vector this time, exploiting the chaos they had created. The element of surprise was gone, but the fundamental advantages of their technique remained. At this altitude and speed, even alerted defenders could not react quickly enough to engage effectively. The anti-aircraft fire that rose to meet them was scattered, uncoordinated, desperately late. They hit supply dumps, fuel storage, anything that presented itself as they screamed across the narrow island. The targets were secondary in importance to the proof of concept. What mattered was demonstrating that the technique worked, that pilots could penetrate defended airspace through methods that minimized their exposure to the fire that had been claiming American aircraft on every conventional mission. On the third pass, something changed. The defenders had begun to adapt. Some anti-aircraft positions had depressed their weapons, attempting to engage the low-level attackers. The fire was still uncoordinated, still hampered by the speed of the approaching aircraft, but it was becoming denser. Buie felt impacts on his aircraft, the distinctive thudding of hits that did not immediately affect control, but that reminded him how thin the margin between success and disaster remained. He called off the attack. His division formed up and turned for the carrier, leaving behind an island that had absorbed more effective punishment in 15 minutes of unconventional attack than in hours of standard bombing. But the cost-benefit calculation was what mattered most. All 4 aircraft had survived. All 4 pilots were returning home. The technique had worked. The debrief was intense. Intelligence officers wanted details about everything: the approach routes, the timing, the defensive reactions, the effectiveness of different targets. Buie walked them through every phase of the attack, drawing diagrams, explaining the reasoning behind each decision. The other pilots in his division added their observations, their perspectives on what had worked and what had been dangerous. The Air Group commander listened without commenting until the formal debrief was complete. Then he asked Buie to remain behind. The conversation that followed was careful, measured, professional. What Buie had done was technically within the scope of tactical discretion. The results were encouraging. But there were concerns about deviation from established doctrine, about the precedent of individual pilots improvising techniques that had not been validated through proper channels. Buie made his case. The losses on conventional strikes were unsustainable. The techniques he had demonstrated offered a potential solution. If other pilots could be trained in these methods, if the doctrine could be modified to incorporate low-level approaches from unexpected vectors, the calculus of island attacks might shift fundamentally. No promises were made, but neither was Buie reprimanded. Instead, he was told to write a detailed report documenting everything he had learned about low-level attack techniques. The implication was clear. Someone with more authority than an air group commander would be making decisions about what came next. The report Buie wrote ran to 17 pages of closely reasoned analysis. He documented the advantages of low-level approaches, the specific techniques required to execute them safely, the training implications for pilots who would need to develop skills that were not part of standard carrier aviation curricula. He included the limitations honestly, acknowledging that the method was not suitable for all targets, that it required exceptional pilot skill, that the margins for error were smaller than in conventional attack profiles. The report went up the chain of command with the mission after action documentation. In the normal course of things, such documents became statistical entries in larger compilations, their individual lessons absorbed slowly into institutional practice over months or years. The pace of warfare rarely allowed for rapid doctrinal adjustment, but the spring of 1944 was not a normal time. The Central Pacific Campaign was accelerating, with major operations planned against the Mariana Islands that would dwarf anything previously attempted. Carrier aviation would be central to these operations, and the losses sustained in preliminary strikes were creating genuine concern among planners who needed to project force across thousands of miles of ocean. Buie's report reached decision-makers who were already searching for solutions to the problem of anti-aircraft attrition. Within weeks, he was reassigned to a training role, tasked with developing formalized instruction in low-level attack techniques. The assignment was unofficial at first, something arranged through personal connections and informal agreements. But the Navy was beginning to recognize that what one pilot had discovered through observation and calculation might represent a significant tactical evolution. The training was challenging. Low-level flight over water was inherently dangerous, and accidents during preparation could undermine the very efficiencies the new techniques were meant to create. Buie developed progression exercises that built skills gradually, starting at altitudes that provided margin for error and working down to the wave-top approaches that actual combat would require. He emphasized navigation, the critical importance of knowing exactly where the aircraft was at all times when flying too low to see beyond the immediate horizon. He stressed situational awareness, the ability to process information about targets, threats, and geography while managing an aircraft at the edge of its performance envelope. The pilots who went through his informal program returned to their squadrons with capabilities their colleagues lacked. In the Marianas campaign, units that had received training in Buie's techniques reported lower losses during strafing operations than those using conventional approaches. The differences were not dramatic. The new methods did not eliminate the dangers of attacking fortified islands from the air, but they shifted the odds, and in a war of attrition, shifting the odds was everything. By summer of 1944, elements of what Buie had developed were appearing in official tactical guidance. The specific procedures he had pioneered became incorporated into broader discussions of fighter-bomber doctrine. The language was bureaucratic, stripped of individual attribution, translated into the impersonal voice of institutional recommendation. But the substance came directly from what one pilot had figured out through observation, calculation, and the willingness to test his conclusions under fire. The impact extended beyond the techniques themselves. Buie had demonstrated that combat innovation could come from operational units, not just from formal research and development programs. His methods of analyzing problems, documenting solutions, and advocating for change became templates that other officers followed. The Navy was developing a capacity to learn and adapt during operations, to incorporate frontline experience into doctrine while the war was still being fought. The cost could be measured in lives saved, in missions accomplished, in the gradual wearing down of Japanese defensive positions across the Pacific. The numbers were never precise. Counterfactuals could not be verified, but the trajectory was clear. The techniques that Buie had demonstrated on that March morning over Mili became part of a broader evolution in carrier aviation that contributed to the eventual American victory. Paul Buie survived the war. This in itself was an achievement that many of his colleagues did not manage. He continued flying in the post-war Navy, adapted to jets, and then to the increasingly specialized world of carrier operations, accumulated the decades of service that turned combat experience into institutional memory. He retired as a captain, respected within the tight community of naval aviators, but largely unknown outside it. The specific contribution he made never became famous. There was no single dramatic moment that could be captured in film or celebrated in official histories. What he had done was think clearly about a problem that was killing pilots, devise a solution through systematic analysis, demonstrate that solution under combat conditions, and then ensure that the knowledge spread to others who could use it. The process was unglamorous but consequential. In later years, when historians began examining the tactical evolution of American naval aviation during World War II, Buie's name appeared occasionally in footnotes and specialized studies. He was recognized as one of several officers who contributed to the development of low-level attack doctrine, one voice in a larger conversation about how to project air power against defended positions. His individual role was not exaggerated. His contribution was acknowledged as part of a collective effort that brought together pilots, planners, engineers, and commanders across the entire Pacific Fleet. This was perhaps the most appropriate recognition. Wars are not won by individuals working alone. They are won by organizations that can learn, adapt, and improve while under pressure. Buie's achievement was not simply that he figured out a better way to attack islands. His achievement was that he created a pathway for his insight to become shared knowledge, institutional practice, military doctrine. The Hellcat he flew that morning over Mili was scrapped after the war, along with thousands of other aircraft that had served their purpose and become obsolete. The carrier Lexington survived longer, decommissioned eventually, and preserved as a museum ship where visitors could walk the flight deck and try to imagine what it had been like to launch into combat over the Pacific. The names of the pilots who flew from those decks faded with the generation that remembered them personally. But the lessons endured in ways that outlasted individual memory. The techniques that Buie developed became foundations for later doctrine, incorporated into training programs that shaped pilots who never knew where the knowledge originated. The principle he embodied, that operational experience could drive tactical innovation, became embedded in American military culture. The questions he asked about why things were done certain ways and whether better ways might exist continued to be asked by officers who had never heard his name. He died in 1987 at home after a long life that had begun in Depression-era South Carolina and ended with the quiet retirement of a man who had done his duty and moved on. There was no monument. There was no biography. There was only the accumulated effect of one clear-minded pilot who looked at a problem that was killing his colleagues and refused to accept that the existing solution was the only solution possible. The Pacific remembers in its own way. The atolls where Buie flew still rise from the blue water, coral and sand reshaped by decades of storms, but essentially unchanged from the geography that naval aviators memorized from reconnaissance photographs. The wrecks of aircraft lie scattered across lagoons and beaches, American and Japanese mixed together in the democracy of defeat and victory alike. Some mornings, when the light is right and the wind is calm, the water takes on the same gray flatness that Buie would have seen rushing beneath his wings as he came in from the sea, too fast and too low for anyone to stop. History rarely rewards the careful thinker who solves problems through analysis rather than heroism. The flash of combat produces clear narratives with identifiable protagonists. The slow work of doctrinal evolution produces better outcomes, but duller stories. Buie belonged to the second category, and his relative obscurity was the predictable result. Yet obscurity is not the same as insignificance. Every pilot who came home from a strafing run because the techniques had improved, every mission that succeeded because tactics had evolved, every small shift in the odds that favored American aviators over Japanese defenders, these accumulated into strategic consequences that helped determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Buie's fingerprints were on that outcome, invisible but present, the mark of someone who noticed what others missed and found a way to make the difference matter. The fighter that came from the sea on that March morning was only one aircraft, carrying only one pilot, attacking. Only one bypass island in an ocean full of similar targets, but it carried with it an idea that would prove more durable than any piece of hardware. The idea that doctrine could be questioned, that observation could yield insight, that improvement was always possible, even in the midst of war, even when established methods seemed adequate, even when the easier path was simply to follow orders and hope for the best. That idea outlasted the Hellcat. It outlasted the war. It outlasted the pilot who brought it screaming in from the open Pacific at 50 feet above the waves. And somewhere, in training programs and tactical manuals and the accumulated wisdom of military organizations that learned to value innovation alongside discipline, it continues still, the longest echo of one morning's calculated risk over a forgotten atoll in the Marshall Islands. Some victories announce themselves in flames and wreckage. Others announce themselves in the quiet survival of men who came home because someone thought clearly about how to keep them alive.